Right, so let's move on. Welcome to the British Airways Baitak. The final session of the day that you've all been waiting for is the Iranian Revolution, the new Shia Axis. We have with us today Barnett Rubin, Barnaby Rogerson, Michael Axworthy, Brenton Betts, who will be moderated by Reza. So without boring you further, I'm going to hand it over to Reza.
Thank you.
There will be time for question and answers at the end.
Yes,
Since it's the final session of the day, we don't mind spilling over a little. Don't worry, we'll have as much as we possibly can.
Yes. I will do my best to try to avoid you, however. I'm just kidding. Yes, welcome to this final session. We're joined by a distinguished panel of experts, both political and religious and cultural as well in this part of the world. You know, not long after the America's so-called war on terror removed Saddam Hussein from power and the Taliban from Afghanistan, it became sort of popular to refer to what King Abdullah of Jordan called the Shia Crescent, this sort of new revival of Shia power in the Middle East in the post 9/11 world. And certainly we've seen over the last few years this very bloody sectarian divide, particularly as it has been exploited by Iran and Saudi Arabia. And now we're seeing, of course, the results of that as a civil war in Syria, as a bloody and brutal crackdown on dissent in Bahrain, in this sort of puritanical vandalizing of Shia places of worship in places like Pakistan. So this is certainly an issue that is very much in the news today. And so we're going to explore a little bit deeper the meaning of it and the history behind this current conflict. With us, as we've talked about already, is Barnett Rubin and Barnaby Rogerson and Michael Axworthy, and we're pleased to be joined by Robert Betts, the author of The Sunni-Shia Divide. And what I'm going to do is just get right into this conversation and talk about what do we mean when we say the Shia Axis? Michael, you have a real problem with this term, so let's just get that out right now.
Yes, I mean, I don't really buy the Shia Crescent theory, and I suppose the Shia...
Can we turn his microphone up just a little bit, please?
The Shia Axis idea perhaps comes from this Shia Crescent theory that you already mentioned, which is a few years old now, perhaps began with King Abdullah of Jordan, taken up by others, including President Mubarak. Tony Blair in his time talked about it too. In many ways, it seemed at that time, in 2006, 7, 8, largely to be more of an alibi for other things rather than actually an explanation of something real in the world for itself. An alibi in the sense that the United States was in difficulty in Iraq. The Iranian threat was useful for that because it was at least appeared to be a partial explanation of why the Americans might be in difficulty in Iraq. Later, the coalition led by the United States got into difficulty in Afghanistan. Similarly, it was sometimes brought in aid there. Well, it's the wicked Iranians again. Across many of the countries we've been talking about, Iraq, Pakistan, and elsewhere, the Shia, insofar as there certainly is a Shia-Sunni confrontation, but in most of the time, the Shias are victims rather than perpetrators. And the evidence for some sort of overarching Iranian-led conspiracy to assert a new wave of Shiism across this whole swath of territory has always been, in my view, very thin indeed.
Yeah. Barnaby, I mean, obviously, there is a political dimension to this, as Michael mentioned, as I talked about, and sometimes the political leaders will stoke sectarian tensions for their own good. That's certainly what Assad has done in Syria. It's what the ruling regime, the Khalifa regime, has done in Bahrain. But one can't deny that there is actually a very serious sectarian divide and conflict that goes back 1,400 years, and that has at its heart a kind of theological dimension. You wrote a lot about the sort of the succession to the Prophet Muhammad and the various divides that occurred back then. Is this a religious conflict? Is it a political conflict? Is it both? How would you define it?
Well, for me, it's excitement, because unlike everybody else here, I'm not an academic. I'm a traveler. And I was totally overexcited by discovering the Shiite story. And I fell in love with Aisha, who's a bit like my own mother, and I could feel the sort of murderous politics. And I'm, as a young historian, hating the way the world was evolving. I was so overexcited to think that there was a part of the world that looked back with memory and total knowledge back to the 7th century. And that was my start off, was just listening to the gossip, the street gossip in the Islamic world about why these things made people so impassioned. And I think for me, it always returns back to this tradition of falling in love with defeat. You know, Imam Ali was rejected by Abu Bakr, Omar, and then replaced by Uthman. And then when he finally gets the caliphate, he's betrayed by Muawiyah. Mughara comes in, takes it away. Then there's the awful battle at Siffin, the negotiation. He's then betrayed by all of these piled up. And why have we, by we I mean the Islamic and those who love the Islamic world, fallen in love with defeat in this way? I mean, and Ali, unlike all the other people, all the other generals who were conquering the Arab Caliphate in those extraordinary years under Abu Bakr and Omar, was at home in Medina. He'd been the warrior and the great defender of the Prophet in his own youth. But he stands outside of all that tradition which so empowers the Sunnis that we were proven to be the people of God because we were given this empire. And then there's this other side of Islam which is always in love with defeat, with the most beautiful defeated man. And of course, the story of Ali is just a prologue to the really exciting, extraordinary tale of Hussein. Hassan gets forgotten. I try to bring up Hassan and again, but you know, Kabbalah brings this whole thing into this sort of martyrology. And with it comes this sort of Platonic ideal, which you know much better than I do, about the Shia stressing for a sort of vision of aspiring for heaven, and the Sunni coping with just, you know, with politics as, okay, we don't respect the sultans or the emirs, but providing they keep the roads open and the wells going, you know, we'll go along. And Shia they dream for the sky. And I'm normally talking to very ignorant English audiences, not to sophisticated Indian audiences. And they always want to know if the Sunni and Shia are Protestant or Catholic. And so the only way to understand the Shia is to think in terms of the English falling in love with King Arthur and combining the sort of Jacobite monasticism, monarchism with communism. And then you've got something, but it's like, whoa, wow. And I want to be a Shia, and we all are in love. Yeah. Even the most Sunni people know that they're in love with the Shiite story. It's a story that is shared by everybody. Everybody weeps for Hussein and Ali, and that's forgotten, you know, time and time, because we concentrate on the doctrinal differences. Is the Holy Family are holy for all Muslims. Yeah. And I don't have to tell this audience that there's no practical difference between the Quran, the acts of prayer, between Sunni and Shia. And without leaping to the end of my talk already, you know, sometime in our lifetime or our grandchildren's lifetime, the Shia will just be saluted as the fifth school of Islam, and we'll wonder what all of this murder has been about.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Well, so it's fascinating because this conception of the Shia that has been fostered for centuries of martyrdom and the righteous suffering, you know, those who were right but oppressed, has in some interesting way been flipped on its head with the rise of Iran as this great political power. Robert, when you think about, so they retitled this the Iranian Revolution, which happened 30-something years ago, by the way, and the Shia Axis. But yes, it's impossible to talk about Shiism in the modern world without talking about the rise of Iran as a regional power. But of course, what Iran today represents, this sort of Khomeiniist ideal, is a different kind of Shiism than sort of the traditional Shiism that Barnaby is referring to.
Well, it came quite late because Iran, for most of its history, after the Prophet Muhammad, was Sunni. It wasn't until the 16th century with the Safavids that it became Shia, and militantly so. And it was quite different from the previous 1,000 years where the Shia were an oppressed minority. Now, except in Cairo during the Fatimid period, where they had 200 years of power, they were powerless. Now, and then when the Fatimids went away, powerless again. Now, with Iran, and till the present day, they have a serious power base from which they can exercise influence in the whole of the Middle East. And we have to remember that the Shia are concentrated in the center of the Islamic world. There's none in North Africa, none in Malaysia, or Indonesia, or very, very few, Bangladesh. But they're all in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the coast of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and of course in Pakistan and India. There are large minorities. They're percentage-wise not that big, but numerically they're about 100 million. So they have.
I think it's working now. I mean, I
Is
can
it?
hear.
Yes.
I can hear from.
If you could take the mic off and hold it.
Okay,
Much closer to the mouth.
it's right there.
That's about as close as it gets, actually. Yeah.
So Iran has sort of redefined Shiism,
Yeah.
especially with the revolution. And I think that's what has upset, well, people like the Saudis, the Wahhabis. They now have a power that they didn't have to really reckon with
Yeah.
30 years ago.
Yeah.
And they are hardly safe, home and dry themselves. They have a problem.
But I'd like to ask you about the flip side of this question, which is the Sunni aspect in Saudi Arabia. But before I do, if you just give me one moment, because I want to emphasize what I sort of hinted at a little bit, which is the difference between the post-revolutionary Shiism of Iran and traditional Shiism. Michael, do you feel comfortable talking about that?
Yes,
I mean, Najaf versus Qom is the easiest way of sort of putting it.
the awkwardness for a newcomer to the subject is that Iran looms very large, and the character of
How can you not hear this? It's feeding back.
the character of Ayatollah Khomeini is the most well-known Shia Muslim of the last 100 years in the wider world. But the kind of Shiism that he represented, the political Shiism that he brought to power with the revolution, was really quite a radical departure at the time he did it from the traditional Shiism that had gone before. And many Shia scholars disagreed at the time with the line that he had taken with what's called the Velayat-e-Faqih, and still do disagree. And so, I mean, that to some extent does limit the ability of Iran and the revolutionary Iran that we're now faced with to lead Shiism elsewhere in the Islamic world. And this idea that somehow Iran is leading in this way is, in my view, incorrect in a number of ways, as I said to start with. But that is one of the ways in which it's incorrect, that many of those Shia communities elsewhere look to different figures.
By the way, Michael refers to himself as a newcomer, which is nonsense. He's written a couple of wonderful books about Iranian history, both ancient and modern Iranian history, that I suggest you get your hands on. Barnett, Iran and the Shia have become the go-to boogie man for much of the Western world, but certainly because of the influence of Saudi Arabia, which is the flip side of this argument. Can you talk a little bit about how the Saudis see Iran? What's their sort of conception of what Iran represents?
Well, if I can just step back from that
Yes,
question
please.
a little bit. I'm a political scientist, not a scholar of religion. And looking
Well,
at...
that was a political question.
Yes, but I'm going to explain why I made that otherwise boring and unconvincing assertion. The concept of the Sunni-Shia axis, or the analysis of Middle Eastern politics in terms of sectarian divide, is a similar strategic ideological move to simplify a complex reality in order to form a coalition, right? You had, at one time everything was analyzed according to whether they were for or against the free world or on the side of the communists. I can remember a time when, when Islamic fundamentalism was identified with Sunnis, and that was considered the big threat, and Shiism was supposed to be the moderate side. If you look at Iran's geopolitical assertion, the kind of Islamism espoused by Ayatollah Khomeini is ambivalent about its Shia character. And on the one hand, it has used the Shia identity as a form of solidarity with other communities in the Middle East. But had it only done that, it would not be a rival with Saudi Arabia for leadership of the Muslim world. Therefore, it has also secularized the Shia myth into a kind of anti-imperialist myth, which can appeal to non-Shia as well. Of course, everyone is aware of Iran's ties to Hezbollah, and other Shia groups. The Alawi in Syria are not actually Shia. During the war in Iraq, the Sunni, whatever we call them, fighters, resistance fighters from Anbar, took refuge in Syria with the support of Hafiz al-Assad because of his orientation toward the United States. The Palestinians of Hamas are not Shia, but given their situation between Egypt and Israel, they turned to Iran for some assistance. And the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan is also not Shia. It has a Shia portion of it, but because the nature of the political conflict in Afghanistan is more ethnic than sectarian, the Iranians have, well, of course, Iran is not such a simple-minded country that it has only one policy at a time. But among its policies has been a support for that general ethnic coalition. So I think that it's much more a rivalry for power and influence in the oil market and in the Middle East between the Iranian and Saudi states, with each trying to articulate a legitimation, I don't mean unsincerely, using in part this discourse of religion, but I've now lived long enough that every 10 or 15 or 20 years I see suddenly a whole new fundamental force that explains everything has emerged, and the Sunni Shia one is one that has emerged within the past couple of decades. Now, a question about Saudi Arabia. I started, and I've been going to Saudi Arabia for work mainly connected to Afghanistan, but what I have been very struck by was the depth and intensity of the anti-Iranian feeling there, to the point where, as you know, to a large extent strategically, Saudi Arabia and Israel are in the same camp. By the way, Israel is not a Sunni Muslim country. And during the heyday of Arab nationalism, Israel was much closer to Iran because there were two non-Arab countries in the Middle East. So these things can change again. But I think the big fear of the Saudis is that they have benefited from the U.S. perception of Iran as a major threat because in every respect except the ideological nature of the current Iranian regime, Iran is a much more natural partner for the United States than Saudi Arabia. It has a huger population, educated, urban, and of course, pro-American, yes. The Iranian population is the least anti-American population in the entire Middle East.
Including Israel.
Including Israel, yes.
Including Israel. That is absolutely true.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when I went to Saudi Arabia in the early days of the Obama administration, I was struck by the intense fear that many of the officials had that because Obama had said a few nice words and sent a Nowruz greeting to the Iranians, that suddenly the United States would change sides. Because they understand, even if Americans do not, that the logic of state-to-state relations dictate that the United States and Iran would work together. And I'll just tell you one story about this. I was once at a meeting of the Bilderberg Group, which, in case you haven't heard of it, is a secret, shady organization of all the elites that meets together to run the world every year. But I attended it twice, and I discovered why they keep their meetings secret, and that's because they don't want anyone to find out that nothing of any significance goes on there. However, they did have a panel on Iran, and I asked a question. I said, do you know of any other enemy of the United States with which we have so many common interests? And after the panel, Henry Kissinger walked up to me, and he said, we have more common interests with Iran, not only than with our other enemies, but then with most of our other allies. So I think Saudi Arabia sees that as a very insecure regime. Of course, they're all over 80, and therefore that is potentially a threat to them. To the credit of the current Iranian government, I say government, meaning the president and
Yes,
not the regime as a whole.
Yes.
They are actually trying to lessen tensions with Saudi Arabia, but that will be very difficult.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, the Saudi influence, especially in trying to derail the current nuclear negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran, has been quite robust. They've been spending millions of dollars trying to convince Congress to scuttle this deal with this new round of sanctions that we're arguing for. And you're right. This relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia is, I mean, you want to talk about the quintessence of the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That sentiment that you were describing about Saudis towards Obama, you definitely see that in Israel. I mean, not long after the 2008 election, I was in Israel, and plastered all over the walls of Jerusalem were posters of Barack Obama dressed in sort of full, Islamic garb, and underneath it said, "Warning, member of Hamas in the White House." And so that sense of fear has created this bond between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is quite odd. Robert, do you feel as though this kind of political contest between Saudi Arabia on the one hand as this self-described leader of the Sunni world, and Iran on the other as the self-described leader of the Shia world, that there is a hope of kind of ameliorating this conflict? And is there any way to deal with this sort of bloody sectarianism that has affected places as far from Saudi Arabia as Pakistan, that we're seeing now in parts of Central Asia? Is there a way to ameliorate that conflict without figuring out a way to get these two countries to get along?
Well, King Abdullah, who's now in his 80s, has reached out to the Shia of Saudi Arabia by appointing them to the Shura Council, which horrified the conservative wing of the Wahhabi movement. But the problem is that the Shia in Saudi Arabia, who are maybe 10% of the population, all live where the oil is.
Yes.
And right next to it is Bahrain, which has a Shia majority,
Yes.
albeit a Sunni king, which also has, it doesn't have much oil anymore, but it's right in the middle of all this. And the Iranians have traditionally had a lot of pull there. So it behooves the Saudis to try and at least make some sort of peace with Iran, and of course their own Shia. But the problem is what Ruben mentioned, was that the ruling elite in Saudi is now ancient. They've all been the sons of King Abdulaziz. Mm-hmm. And the next king is going to come from a younger generation, and no one knows who that is going to be. So there's a potential for a really destabilizing transition of power in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Michael, did you want to?
I think there's a further thing to that which we haven't said directly yet, and but the point about the Shia minority in Saudi Arabia and the fact that they're located where the oil is located is important, because the Saudis and other monarchies in the southern side of the Persian Gulf do have a queasiness and an uncertainty, particularly since the Arab Spring, about their own autocratic nature and their own failure to bring forward properly representative institutions. And so the Shia threat, it serves as a kind of alibi for that insecurity. Instead of saying the problem is we don't have government that represents our own people, and we therefore have a problem about our own legitimacy, instead of facing that and perhaps bringing forward more representative institutions, they say that all the unrest is the fault of the wicked Iranians. It's the Iranians muscling in and manipulating this, trying to remove our regimes. And so, once again, it's a political move to avoid the real problem.
Yeah. Barnaby, I want to end with the question for you before I get out to the audience. I've had a lot of interesting experiences in the Middle East as an Iranian, and I remember two times in particular when I was living in Egypt. You know, you take cabs everywhere, and when I get into a cab, eventually, you know, the conversation is, where are you from? And I don't say I'm from America, I say I'm from Iran. And usually there's an assumption there that because I'm from Iran, I'm Shia. I'm not Shia, but nevertheless, the point is that just simply saying Iran is synonymous with saying Shia. And one of two things happens. Either the cab driver says, oh, my friend, you know, we are brothers, and, you know, during the Ahmadinejad years, it was always like, Ahmadinejad, huh? Yeah, stick it to Bush, stick it to Bush. And, you know, we're cousins, and everything's wonderful. But then one time, I remember clearly, the cab driver said, you know, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Iran, and he just went, and I said, oh, come on, we're brothers. He said, we're not brothers, you're going to hell. And I said, come on, you know, this is it. And finally, he just sort of stopped the cab in the middle of the street and said, get out. Which reminds me of this larger sort of joke that you made about Catholics and Protestants.
Yes.
That there is this idea that Catholics and Protestants are just fundamentally at odds. And listen, I have met Protestants who believe that the Pope is the whore of Babylon. And I have met Catholics who think that all Protestants speak in tongues and drink poison. But then I've met Catholics and Protestants who say, well, what's the big deal? We're all Christians. And that is very much what's happening in the Muslim world, right? I mean, most Muslims would say Sunni, Shia, whatever. And then there are those who say that there's a divide. You ended on a very hopeful note. And I'm curious, what gives you that sense of hope? Is it just about who we are, or is there something that you can hold on to think that maybe the kind of at least detente that we have seen in Europe between Catholics and Protestants can actually happen between Sunni and Shia?
I think it is possible. You know, there was that critical moment in the Jerusalem conference when the Ottoman Caliphate had been abolished by the Turks themselves, and we know the Ottomans weren't true possessors of the Caliphate in any way. It's something they assumed. But there was that marvelous moment when the Nizam of Hyderabad was one of the candidates. The Hashemites were looking to be another. The Egyptian dynasty were also very keen to put themselves forward. And there were Shia delegations there. And there was a feeling at that moment of acute weakness in the Islamic world when, you know, the last great empire had fallen yet again to the European powers. They were dividing up the Ottoman Empire. And there was a coming together at that moment, which can reoccur. But to carry on the other part of your question is that I'm also a publisher, and so I deal with books. And when I have a book that's about the general Islamic world, all the different buyers say, we don't want that. We either want a book about Bahrain or, you know, the Gulf. People, beyond this sort of smokescreen of sharing a great concern with Islam, there are these endless, as you know, ethnic and national realities. And unlike the sort of Sunni Shia sort of obsession, I'm fairly convinced that the political power in the Arabian Peninsula, whatever it is, and that in the Iranian plateau, will always loathe and hate each other. It's a bit like the French and English. You know,
Yes.
it's you know, you can have a revolution, you can change. There are these blocks which will always be rivals against each other. And coming back again to something else that interests me a lot is your journey into Egypt. As you know, that was the Shiite dream achieved, the center of the Fatimid Empire, which we know quite often Shia is better as a mythology, as an empowering element in spirituality, went odd, but it left behind this extraordinary Sunni Shia imprint, which you must have noticed. You know, this is the place where Hussein's head was. Right. You've got, you know, the Prophet's granddaughter buried there. You've got an extraordinary sort of Shiite social practice of the saints that connect up, which reminds me again with Morocco. You've got a Shiite royal dynasty, in a way, descended directly from the Prophet Muhammad, in a sort of community that thinks itself purely Sunni, but have got many, many Shia attributes. And again, we're probably going to talk about it later, but the other question was always asked, particularly in England, is where do the Sufi comes in? We're trying to sort out Shia and Sunni. And I say one of the ways to, you know, understand the Sufi is that it's the Sunni getting hold of the spiritual jewels of the Shiite world.
That's a nice way of putting it.
And so sort of sharing it out with the Sunni community. And when you talk in that way, and not geopolitics, you can see that we're all evolving and sharing that. And you can almost chronicle, as the Sunni world possesses bits of Shiite thought. And arguably, post-1979, the whole, I think we talked about this privately in the lift, the whole of the Sunni world was very, very excited. They wanted to be revolutionary. The Saudis started, rivalry of dress and of executions, and it upped the whole grade for all of Islam. And the whole sort of, mullah-led fundamentalism is sort of in envy of Khomeini. And I found out as a young child that I shared the same birthday as the Ayatollah. And I can remember getting terribly excited, age 19, in 1979, when he took over and reversed the world. I'm not a great admirer of American superpower, and I had this sort of awful mood as a child that the whole world was going to be full of tarmac shopping centres and sprawling suburbs, and Colgate was going to become the empire that dominated the world. And I can remember, I've got it embarrassingly, turning up to fancy dress as the Ayatollah Khomeini before I realized that he was a mass murderer and a mad... I was terribly excited that the world had changed. You had spirituality leading the agenda, not just endless power politics and oil and money.
Well, I think Khomeini took a lot of people by surprise.
Yes?
Yes.
I hate to disappoint you, but when I was picked up at the airport in Tehran by the Foreign Ministry of Iran in 1994, they were driving a Cadillac.
Okay, we have about 30 minutes for Q&A. Please wait for the microphone. Those who've had previous sessions with me know that I have a very strict policy of men and then women, men and then women. There's no, if a man asks a question, until we get a woman to ask a question, we will not move forward. But please refrain from either an anti-Sunni or an anti-Shia diatribe, if you would. Thank you. Okay, that's great. So we're also going to try to go from front and back as well. So let's start at the front here.
My question is to Ruben. The issue is oil, isn't it? We expect US as a superpower, technological superpower. Why do you get over this oil stuff? And if you've got the flexibility now, isn't it because of the fracking and reducing your dependence on oil? Thank you.
Oil.
Well, oil is very important, but there's no one thing that is it. And one of the most important characteristics of oil is the ease with which it is turned into money. One of the characteristics of money, which is very important, is the ease with which states can turn it into power. So you have oil, money, and power all together, hard to distinguish from each other. For instance, if you take the war in Iraq, the United States did not go to war in Iraq because it wanted to get control over, because it needed the oil of Iraq in order to create energy. If it wanted the oil of Iraq, there was a very simple way to get it: suspend the sanctions against Iraq and buy it.
Yeah.
It is much cheaper and more effective than going to war. But in fact, that was not their concern. Their concern was the money that was going to Saddam Hussein, which enabled him to strengthen his state in pursuit of a strategic objective that was inimical to U.S. interests as they conceived of it. So I think the political and strategic issues are predominant, and oil is very important for that, primarily because of its economic importance.
Anybody have anything they want to add to that?
Well, yes, just that one of the interesting factors in this whole oil picture is that recently we had the confirmation of huge oil and gas reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean, on the coast of Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and the coastal portion of Syria, which is Alawite. And this, at the moment, only Israel is exploiting it. But soon these others will, and that is going to, I think, add another equation. Also, the U.S. is vastly expanding its production of oil and becoming less dependent. So we have, I think, a whole shift in the international oil production game.
And hence a possible shift in our
Yes.
national interests.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Middle East will become less important to us, to the United States.
Yeah.
And perhaps, just as an extra point to that, particularly Saudi Arabia becomes less important because Saudi Arabia, as the #1 oil producer, is less important if America takes so much oil from fracking, and it's less important again if Iran comes back into the picture as a major oil producer and as an alternative, perhaps neutral power, but perhaps even ally of the United States in the region. That puts more pressure on Saudi Arabia to perhaps tighten up on some of the extremism that originates there.
And it allows the United States to finally get rid of a friend that it just doesn't want to have. You know, that I think of the Saudi-American relationship like that one friend that you have who has like a really great TV, but you just can't stand. But then, you know, you want to watch the football game. And finally you get your own TV and you never have to hear from him again. A lady in the back, please. I will literally wait for the rest of the evening. How about a lady in the front?
Two points which I'd like to make. One, you mentioned Catholic, Protestant, similar to Shia-Sunni divide. I want to understand how much does the Catholic-Protestant divide affect the politics of those countries? And that is the difference between the Shia and Sunni divide to my mind. But the Shia-Sunni divide determines the politics of their countries. But does the Catholic and Protestant divide also determine the politics of the country? Second point, is that this frisson within the Muslim world about Shias and Sunnis plays into the hands of the world politics. It weakens the Muslim world. So how can you be optimistic, as you mentioned, about a future?
I think both those questions are for you, Barnaby. And perhaps...
Could you say them shortly?
Yes, so the argument is that in what ways does the Catholic-Protestant divide actually play itself out in political issues and political conflicts? Because obviously the Sunni-Shia divide does. And then secondly, how do you, where do you get off being so goddamn optimistic? But with the first question, you know, as a Brit,
Yes.
let's talk about, you know,
Okay,
Britain's
my
issue.
personal story.
Yeah.
My father's from an ancient Catholic family, and my mother's from an ancient Protestant family. And my two grandfathers, who I revere, tried to stop the marriage. This is just in my childhood. They were identical. One was in the army, one was in the navy. They hunted together in the same county in England. They were of the same class, same education. And there's such violence that I've seen diminish. But of course, famously in Northern Ireland, which I know quite well and often go to, it's alive and well, and it's a spitting. And then you've got people, the Irish, there's no ethnic difference between the Northern Irish and the Irish. There's exactly the same gene pool. And Ireland and Scotland have got this sort of very, very tight, you know, DNA structure from 5000 BC. So you think that's a mad world. And the other thing to think about the Catholics and Protestants is it fueled civil wars in Britain all over the 17th century, all over Europe. But also, rather fascinatingly, if you chart the places that end up Protestant and the places that end up Catholic, they're within 50 or 80 miles of the old frontier of the Roman Empire. And so there's a rather chilling moment that we get terribly excited about these ethnic things, but we're looking at a really deep, long view of history, that there are cultural differences, mostly about landscape and about diet and things like that. And so you've just got to sort of, you know, hover up and realize that, you know, and also it's an act to defend ourselves against the wicked politicians using what is a spiritual dream of self-enhancement and world enhancement that the Prophet Muhammad and Imam Ali gave us, to twist that into a cause to kill people. We've all got to grab some optimism, because otherwise you just get dragged down. It's a bit like bringing the news every day into your television, into your home. You're bringing violence into your home. You're watching it with your children and your grandmother beside you. And you've got to also step out and start dreaming of the end of the road.
And frankly, if you were living in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, you had no business being optimistic. And yet, today, I mean, it's certainly not over, but there is a political reconciliation that has at least paved the way for the possibility of thinking about a pure, peaceful future.
It is true, and just another example from not from England or Ireland this time, from Scotland. People can very quickly, as you can do in India, quickly ask you a few questions. Where do you go to school? What's your grandmother's name? And they quickly place you, whether it's Patrick, whether it's any Catholic name in your given family, which football team do you support? Edinburgh, Dundee, Glasgow are divided passionately on which football team you support. The same with Liverpool, which is a city divided and has been since the 19th century when it was born, with violent antagonisms based on culture, and that is washing away. And I don't believe Britain is, I mean, church attendance is going down in Britain, but I believe spirituality is growing individually. And I think, so often you just think, people turning up in the mosque, does that mean a religious country? We know it doesn't mean it. I mean, the acts of God working in your life, how you treat your neighbor, that's always got to be the test.
Barnett, did you?
Well, also, I'm not sure if the intention of the question was to draw a contrast between Christianity, where sectarianism is much less important, and Islam, where it is. But talking about Christianity, let us not restrict ourselves to Protestantism and Catholicism in the last 50 years. During that same period, there have been extremely violent, bloody wars between Orthodox and Catholic Christians, especially in the Balkans. And the only difference between Serbs and Croats, they speak exactly the same language and have the same culture, is that Serbs are Orthodox and Croats are Catholic, which reflects the frontier, actually, of the Byzantine and then the Ottoman Empire, as opposed to the Habsburg and the Holy Roman Empires as well. So if we go back to I don't know if you were familiar with the 30 Years' War, but the 30 Years' War in Europe was a war over state formation in which different rulers legitimated their wars on the basis of Catholicism and Protestantism, and was finally settled in the Peace of Westphalia. And in a way, it's analogous to what is happening in the Middle East today, which is still going through the post-Ottoman transformation and fighting over these states which were drawn on the map by the British colonialists. And now you have, again, a religiously colored contestation over the form of state power. That is, and how it will end, it's not going to be another Peace of Westphalia, but it is in many ways a very similar conflict.
Gentleman in the back. Anyone, you get to decide.
Hello, sir. My question is very simple. Who are these Kurds and what are they fighting for? Whether they are Shia or they are Sunni. That's it. Thank you.
Who are the Oh, Kurds. Oh, Kurds. I'm sorry. Well, Michael, a lot of Kurds in Iran. You want to talk about?
Well, there are Kurds in Iran, there are Kurds in Syria, in Turkey,
Iraq,
and in Iraq. I mean, it's some people say it's the one great nation of the Middle East that never came into
It got left out.
being.
Yeah, it got left out in the great compartmentalization.
Should have happened in 1919, but didn't. As to their religion, most Kurds are Sunni, but there are minorities that are Yazidi and other minor sects, and some Shia, but predominantly Sunni.
Alevi in Turkey.
Yeah.
They're Kurds, largely. So,
Did you want to add to that a little more?
well, just that they have their own language, although it's related to Farsi. But they definitely have their own identity. They are Kurds,
Oh, absolutely.
and they're very bitter that they don't have a state. But unfortunately, where they are is also where the oil is, in Turkey, in Iraq, northern Iraq, in eastern Syria. So there was never a chance.
Though maybe there's more of a chance
Now, well, they actually have a state in northern Iraq, in de facto.
Yeah, it's a state
Autonomous
in all
region.
but name, yeah.
Yes.
But I think it's very important that in Iraq, the three largest national ethnic identities are generally referred to as Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
Which shows that the fight between Sunni and Shia is not, in today's world, it's not a religious fight over doctrine. It is a political fight over power in which religion is a mobilizing force. I won't just say it's used as if it were insincere, but because the Kurds have an ethnic problem with the Arab state of Iraq. The Sunni and Shia have a religio-ethnic problem with the sharing of power in Iraq. But there's no, you know, if it were simply doctrinal, then the Kurds would be allied primarily with the Sunnis, but they're not because of the way that the state is structured.
A lady in the front area? Oh, right up in the front row. Yes, you don't have to stand up. No.
Yes. What I wanted to ask is that one thing I do not really share your very optimistic view of coexistence, because the conflicts between Shias and Sunnis are on the rise, so much so that Hassan Sarur, one of the Muslim, this thing only said ki instead of focusing on end of civilization in terms of Muslims and this thing, it's now Muslims versus Muslims, you know, of different type. So I don't know why it is happening. I'm considering that they've stayed together for almost 13 years, not with so many clashes. What I wanted to observe is that is this situation actually being created by the outside world, especially America, the way, because after all, Shias were not seen as very powerful religious entity so long as Shah was a favorite of America. After that, now, you know, and also when America was not such a, you know, the Saudi Arabia and Americas were not such partners, right? Over the time, the Shia-Sunni conflict between Saudi Arabia between Saudi Arabia and Iran is actually a result of the global politics and the way America has taken sides or shifting sides or whatever it is.
Barnett, do you want to talk about America's grand master plan to manipulate the Shia and Sunni in the world into killing each other so that they ignore America?
I prefer to hear from the British about how they invented Wahhabism.
Yeah, exactly. It all starts there, doesn't it? It really does.
Mea culpa, yes. But perhaps we can, out of that question, which I didn't fully hear, just remind ourselves, we heard very accurately about the terrifying role of oil, how it destroys the political structure, because it's converted very quickly into money that allows you to pay your militia and your secret police and your Republican Guard, and how, by and large, most Muslim communities are cursed with oil. And we can dream of places where Islam are going to develop and enrich itself outside of the geopolitical nerve centers of oil. And I'm looking at you lot. The biggest community in the Islamic world is Indo-Pakistan. This is the largest population. If you add Indonesia, which is from the same spiritual tradition, this great bloc, which hasn't got oil, and is not worried about, the world doesn't report much about Indonesian Islam. The world reports nothing about Indian Islam. Only this week, you know, this extraordinary trail of the man in charge of the Bohra Ismaili community dying in Bombay, the 52nd leader of this community. The absolute devotion there got nothing to do with oil and power. That's a sort of enriching world that's active here. And I also say that Britain is also a place, because I'm slightly involved in the Islamic community there, where the Muslims have scattered from all over the world, removed from power, and allowed to think and interpret it without it being considered to be a threat to the Ministry of Interior or the President. And in a funny way, we're concentrating on the wrong issue. Places that produce oil will always going to have revolutions and power, and world powers are obsessed by them. And Islam will grow outside of those zones.
Yeah. Michael, I want to talk to you about this too, particularly about where Barnaby ended, which is about Islam in Europe, particularly Islam in the UK. What's fascinating about Islam in the United States is that you don't see the same kind of sectarianism that you see in Muslim majority states because there are so few Muslims. You know, when you're in Pakistan, that's the Shia mosque, that's the Sunni mosque, you know, that's the whatever is Ismaili mosque, the Nazaris are over here. Yeah. But in the US, you know, it's just the one mosque and you all have to go, you know, to that. There's no other mosque. There's a one mosque.
Not in New York.
Not in New York, yeah. But in a sense, I mean, do you feel as though that the future of this kind of more pluralistic, non-sectarian conception of Islam is actually going to flourish outside of the center of the Muslim world, that instead it might be in Europe, it might be in the West?
I think that's, I think it's conceivable. But you have to note that at the same time, there has been Islamic extremism, radicalism, which has bubbled up from within the UK as well. So it's not automatically such a rosy picture. But I mean, I know Iranian Muslims who've been to the UK and have very happily gone to Sunni-dominated mosques and have
Well,
worshipped
I guess
there.
what I'm saying
And
is, so for instance, the sort of puritanical jihadists that arise out of the UK are killing non-Muslims. They're not killing Shia, as opposed to the puritanical
though some of them
groups.
are going to Syria and doing so.
In order to kill, yeah, that's right. At least they're kind enough to not do it in the UK.
I mean, that's a phenomenon which is about communities and I would say largely about dislocation and alienation felt by some immigrant communities and some members, younger members of immigrant communities in the UK, which is not, again, it's religion as a lightning rod or as a way out of a problem, rather than something actually to do with religion itself.
A gentleman, a question from a gentleman. I don't know where the mic is. Yes. Anyone you'd like. Oh,
Yeah.
yes,
I just have
I've
this
not
question.
forgotten about you.
I just have this question. Is it more appropriate? Is it more appropriate to see this Shia-Sunni divide, this Shia-Sunni rivalry, as a continuation, as a historical continuation of the Arab-Persian divide? Did you get my question?
Yes, yes. Is it more appropriate to think of the Sunni-Shia divide as a sort of a version of the Arab-Persian divide? Asked the person doing a very good Jerry Pinto impersonation. Anybody else notice that? No? Yes.
Who are you to...
Anyone, yes.
Well, the Arab-Persian divide is also evoked in these conflicts. You know, during the Iran-Iraq war, there was a lot of rhetoric about Qadisiyya, which was the Caliphate armies against the whichever Persian Empire it was, Sassanid Empire. However, that was a depiction of it by Iraq, I believe, because Iraq was on the right side of that, whereas the Iranians were depicting Saddam's forces as Qawai Kufr, the forces of unbelief. So depending on what your interest was, you could depict it either as a religious struggle or an ethnic struggle. In Afghanistan, one of the ways that the Pashtun Islamist groups got the support of the Arabs was by encouraging them in their mistaken belief that Tajiks were Shia because they spoke Persian.
Right.
And some of the Arabs, in particular, Abdullah Azam, the Palestinian who was the leader of the Afghan Arabs, though he and Osama went separate ways, and Abdullah preceded him to Jinnat in 1989, was quite shocked when he went to Panjshir and found that Masood was a very religious Sunni Muslim. So again, there's no one thing, you know, the quest for clarity of this sort is a political quest in order to define your enemy and your allies, to consolidate your forces. It is not a useful analytic tool.
Bob, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I just wanted to add that in the Iraq-Iran war, the majority of the soldiers fighting for Iraq were Shia against the Shia army of Iran. So, and there's a lot of enmity between
and
that
Khomeini
generation.
tried very hard to reach out to the Iraqi Shia to sort of get them to turn against Saddam Hussein, it never happened.
And Saddam Hussein emphasized the Arab identity around Qadisiyah in order to keep them on his side.
Right.
And to try to reach out to the Arab minority in southern
Iran.
which is where the oil is.
That's right. Yes. Yes, a question from a lady. I think there's one. Oh, anywhere. Right. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I think, okay. Hi, is there a difference in opinion regarding Israel between, for the Shias and Sunnis? And if so, what impact will that have on the chances of peace over there?
Well,
Is there a difference among Sunni and Shia about how each looks at Israel, and what impact would that have in sort of this sectarian divide?
Well, no.
Well, in fact, it's not even the Saudis, it's just the royal family, and that's it.
Yeah, no, there are bigger, much huger differences among Sunnis about Israel and among Shia about Israel. There's no systematic difference. In the just to go back to something I mentioned earlier, in the 1960s, when the dominant ideology in the Arab world was Arab nationalism, Israel was geopolitically aligned with non-Arab Iran. So if you were going to make a religious analysis, you'd say the Shia are more friendly. Now, because of the geopolitical orientation of revolutionary Shia Iran, Israel is allied with Wahhabism. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with religious doctrine. And by the way, the state of Israel is not founded on religious doctrine. It's a conflict not yet. It's a conflict over land that you can find in every village in the world. Unfortunately, the more religion is evoked to justify the conflict over land, the more it becomes difficult to solve.
And I just say that before the 1982 invasion of Lebanon by Israel, the Shia, who are on the southern border with Israel, were completely apolitical. They weren't interested. I mean, their concern was improving their lot as the poorest element in Lebanon. But with the invasion, they suddenly became politicized. And then now they're the most politicized through Hezbollah, which its sole aim is to recover Jerusalem for Islam.
Yeah.
So,
I, for one, totally agree with Barnett on the emphatic negative. But I think that historically it's worth bearing in mind that most Muslims believe the Crusader state, of which they see Israel as a direct successor, was enabled by the dramatic schism between the Fatimid and the Sunni state there. And that, coincidentally, the Crusader state was only destroyed when a Kurd took Sunniism and united and took over from the Fatimid, the Shiite state, and brought the whole resources of the Middle East to push out the Christians from Ark in 1291. And it is imagery, and it's what excited me first of all about Islam is the history might not be known by the Western democratic audience, but my God, it's known in Islamic, in the Middle East. Saddam, all his speech making was larded with endless references to Saladin and the role, as we know.
Yeah, and during the Iran-Iraq War, it was you would have these Tezier plays that were celebrating, not celebrating, but yes, the death of Hussein, and the armies of the Caliph would wear Iraqi uniforms. You know, it was that clear of, you know, the sort of the fact that what is the famous saying that the past, Faulkner's saying that the past is not even past. Okay, I promised. Yes, sir, gentlemen.
Since it's already 6 p.m., last two
This will be
questions.
okay.
I just wanted to offer a comment and seek your response to the fact that, you know, when we go back in time, the ruling classes in the Middle East, the Muslim world, were largely Sunni, and the people in the Shias. This is also goes back to a time if we see that the Shia aspect, the religion of Islam, was more nuanced and it was a little more adaptive and a little more, it was accepting, I would say, old cultural carryovers. Unlike the Sunni, you know, the Sunnis, because they form more, they're a little more particular about what they advocate. So this conflict, if we take countries, you take Syria, for example, and you take a lot of other countries, you take Iran, for example. And this conflict, Iranians, when the Arab armies came, they were the Sunni armies, then why are Iranians mainly Shia? There is an aspect to that when this happened, at that time, as a religion, the people who
So
propagated
we're
Shia.
running out of time. Just if you could please address the question so that.
What are your views?
I don't think I can. But there was one.
It started
Go
with
ahead.
the point about the Sunni elite being
Yeah.
used to.
That's a very good point.
To rule, and the Shia being accustomed to the position of being a minority. And I think that basic mindset, for large parts of the area we're talking about, that is still important as an underlying attitude or approach. The Sunnis don't really accept that Shia should have a say in some of these places.
There was one part of that question, though, that I think is it wasn't really, I don't think he meant it as a question, but it's something that I'm absolutely fascinated by, and I would love to hear, Barnaby, you answer it, which is, why did Iranians become Shia?
This extraordinary character.
Why did Persians become Shia?
Ismail, the descendant of the 7th Imam, heir to a great Sufi brotherhood, also for his maternal line from Genghis Khan's blood, created this extraordinary, it's like extraordinary science fiction. It created this power block in what is really the Kurdish hills, and created...
Another Kurd, supposedly.
Yes, the Kizilbash, these devoted Shiite early martyrs, and really took... Iran was never destined to be Shia. We talked earlier about these ethnic divisions. And if you can see one character like Khomeini in 1979, you can also see this man really shaking the whole world up. And it made the Ottoman Empire, which didn't really know what it was just sort of Turks, and the Bektashi were quite close to being sort of Shia in their way, and they were the main Sufi group backing the Ottoman Empire. So in reversal to what was happening in Iran, Selim the Grim became a defined Sunni and started, a terror campaigning. I think at least 250,000 Shiites were destroyed and killed in central Anatolia, and the rest of them were shifted off to the Balkans, the ones he wanted to spare. And it's not really your question, but it's something I wanted to air as well, is that you're quite right about in the Lebanon, the Shia, the underclass, and in Iraq they've been made the underclass. They're combined, of course, with this royal mysticism of the descent from the Prophet's bloodline, which also, as you know very well, in India is a big issue about exactly if your own heritage is from someone who's come as a fully Muslim or you've been converted as a Bengali. And that underlies, I gather, quite a lot of Shia-Sunni differences in Hyderabad as well, and in Sindh, and that's another sort of context. So as well as the Shia being in the underclass, they've also got this sort of royal blood that ties in with this obsession of genealogical tracement that goes into most of the Muslims I've talked to in Pakistan know exactly where they've come from, or they're claimed to, in their surname, whether Quraishi or Shofa, and that is a very, very bizarre but live issue.
Excuse me, I don't know the history that well, but if I'm not mistaken, the establishment of Shiism as the state religion in Iran in the 16th century coincided with the rise of the Ottoman and Mughal empires on both sides of Iran, which were Sunni-led empires. And so it was, at least in part, a geopolitical choice to establish an ideological basis for opposition and defense against those rival empires.
It was also that final battle between...
Yeah. So again, these identities are political.
Did you want to add to that?
So Shah Abbas imposed Shiism by law.
Yeah.
Where we
Quite
could.
brutally, yeah.
To stop infiltration.
By either side, yes.
Yes, we have time for a question from a lady. Yes, William. William down.
Just going to say that the same divide also in India. where you get the Mughal Empire, which is Sunni, taking on the Deccani Sultanates, Ahmednagar, Bijapur, Golconda, and that is a strong political divide down the center of the Vindhyas between Sunni and Shia. And the Mughal emperors are waging a form of jihad when they're using Rajput armies from Jaipur and Jodhpur to attack Shia Muslim sultanates in the center.
Unless there's a desperate question from a lady. Okay,
You
yes,
know,
there is.
she's been
Yes,
waiting
very, very
from the
quick.
very start.
Very quick question, and then we will let you all
Thanks.
go home.
So I just wanted to know, don't you think this Shia-Sunni divide is being replaced by a Wahhabi, non-Wahhabi divide? I mean, the rise of
very good
Wahhabism
question,
is
yeah.
it's dangerous. It's in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. It's just spreading like wildfire. So what do you have to say?
Sure,
on
I mean, these Wahhabi extremists in Central Asia are not just killing Shia, they're killing other Sunnis as well. So do you think, and Christians certainly, do you think that that's a legitimate thing? Are we seeing what will eventually become a Wahhabi, non-Wahhabi influenced divide?
Well, you mentioned that Saudi Arabia is our worst best friend. For the fact that such examples of their supporting the jihadists in Syria, who are beheading priests and kidnapping bishops and nuns, and this has caused a great deal of ill feeling in the States, at least in people I know.
Well, I think there's no reason to believe that in the future conflict will be clearer than it is in the past, and in the past. And just as it is fractal and multifaceted today, it will be in the future. There won't be one big thing that will be different from today's pseudo big thing.
Barnett Rubin, Barnaby Rogerson, Michael Axworthy, Robert Betts, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.